I made it without you, I said. The words came out flat, almost proud, like a fact I'd rehearsed for years. He was standing at the counter, sorting mail with the same careful focus he'd always had, like order might still protect him from what was inside those envelopes. My sentence settled between us and didn't move. His hand stopped. Just for a second. Long enough for me to see what I'd touched. I hadn't meant it as a weapon. I'd meant it as proof. Proof that leaving had been worth it. That the distance, the silence, the years of not coming back had added up to something solid. But the room tightened anyway. Not with anger. With recognition. He didn't look at me. He didn't argue. The quiet that followed felt earned, like interest on a debt I'd been postponing. And standing there, watching him absorb another thing without comment, I understood too late that without you wasn't the triumph I wanted it to be. It was just the part I'd learned to say out loud. Growing up, I learned early that movement looked like escape. Our house wasn't cruel or loud or broken in the obvious ways. It was solid, predictable. The kind of place where nothing dramatic happened, but nothing ever really lifted either. My brother fit there naturally. He knew how to stay in a room without needing to be seen, how to listen without planning an exit. I was the opposite. I talked. I paced. I watched doors more than people. As kids, that difference felt harmless, even useful. He was dependable. I was promising. Adults trusted him and encouraged me. Teachers told me I'd go far. No one ever asked who would stay behind to make sure far still had something to come back to. We shared a room for years. Late nights, quiet agreements, jokes whispered after the lights were off. He remembered details. I remembered feelings. If something broke, he fixed it. If something stalled, I found a way around it. We didn't fight much. We just learned our places early. When our mother got sick, those places hardened. Someone had to stay close. Someone had to learn schedules, medications, the sound of breathing that might change in the middle of the night. My brother stepped into that role without announcement. I stepped back, telling myself it was temporary, that I'd help differently, that leaving didn't mean abandoning. People told me I was brave for going, for not letting life stop. Opportunities arrived wrapped in praise. I accepted them because saying no felt like waste. Every step forward made the next one easier. Every mile away made returning feel heavier. At first, I called home often, then regularly, then when time allowed. Conversations shortened. Updates replaced presence. When things got quiet on the line, I filled it with plans. Movement always sounded better than stillness. From where I stood, my brother's life looked contained. Limited, maybe, but manageable. I told myself he liked it that way, that he was built for responsibility, that being needed gave him shape. It was easier to believe that than to imagine he was absorbing weight I didn't know how to carry. Years passed without ceremony. I built a life that looked good in motion. New cities, new routines, new people who only knew the version of me that left. When I came back to visit, I brought stories, energy, noise. The house seemed quieter by contrast. I mistook that for stagnation. What I didn't notice, what I didn't want to notice, was how much effort it took to keep everything exactly the same. How my brother's stillness wasn't lack of ambition, but constant adjustment. How staying wasn't neutral. It was work. I told myself we were both paying something. I just never learned how to measure his cost. The moment it stopped being abstract came through the phone, not the door. He didn't sound panicked when he called. That should have warned me. His voice was controlled, almost rehearsed, like he'd already gone through the conversation alone, and was now letting me hear the summary. He talked about deadlines, notices, numbers that had crossed from manageable into fixed. I listened, walking in slow circles, nodding to myself as if agreement could count as support. I said the right sounds at the right times. Okay, I see. That's rough. What I didn't say was, I'm coming home. When there was a pause, I filled it the way I always did, with logic. I told him how these things usually worked, how there were options, how people reinvented themselves. Then I said it, clean and simple, like an answer. You know, you could have left too. The line went quiet. I told myself I meant freedom, that I was offering perspective, not judgment. But the sentence carried something else. It rewrote the past in my favor. It turned his staying into a choice instead of a consequence. It erased the years where someone had to be there so I wouldn't have to. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed. Not louder, just flatter. He said, "Okay," the way people do when they've learned something they didn't ask for. He didn't ask me for help. He didn't accuse me. He ended the call politely, like the conversation had served its purpose. I stood there afterward, phone still warm in my hand, realizing too late that the problem wasn't the bill he'd described. It was the certainty in my own voice when I suggested leaving, as if departure had always been available to both of us. That was the point of no return. Not because something broke between us in that moment, but because something I'd believed about myself no longer held. I hadn't escaped the cost. I'd outsourced it. After that call, nothing dramatic happened. That was the problem. Life didn't correct itself. Time didn't intervene. Everything simply continued, carrying the new weight quietly. I came back months later, telling myself it was overdue, a longer stay, real presence. I framed it as concern, maybe even generosity. I didn't call ahead. I never did back then. I still thought access was permanent. The house opened the same way it always had. Same smells, same light in the late afternoon. I remember feeling relieved by how unchanged it was, like continuity itself was proof that nothing had gone wrong. I said it out loud. It's exactly the same. And waited for him to agree. He didn't. He said, "That's because I made it that way." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I didn't yet know how to hear it. Living there again, even briefly, showed me things I'd never had to notice before. How the house bent around me without discussion. How my presence rearranged his routines automatically. I slept late. He adjusted. I left dishes. They disappeared. Not because he offered, because he'd been trained to absorb friction before it made noise. At night, we sat at the table we grew up around. I talked about plans forming, possibilities reopening, the language of someone whose life still assumed forward motion. He talked about appointments, repairs, timelines. I listened, nodded, offered advice that required nothing from me. When there were gaps in the conversation, I filled them with compliments. "You're strong. You've always handled things." The words sounded supportive. I didn't realize they were also absolving me. I noticed the fatigue before I acknowledged it. The way his shoulders held tension even when he sat. The way silence clung to him. One night I said, "You look tired," as if naming it might resolve it. He shrugged. There was no space left for explanation. You don't explain exhaustion when it's become infrastructure. When I left again, I told myself the visit had been good, necessary. I said we'd talk more. I believed it, in the shallow way people believe things that don't demand follow-through. But the calls changed. Shorter, careful, less room for improvisation. When I suggested solutions, selling the house, starting over, I meant well. I always did. I just never noticed how every suggestion translated into leave, and how leaving was the one thing he'd never been free to do. "The house is the reason you can still talk about starting fresh," he said once. I didn't respond, not because I disagreed, but because the sentence didn't fit anywhere I'd prepared for it to land. That was the escalation. Not anger, not confrontation. Just the steady realization that every time he tried to name the cost, I converted it into advice. And advice, I was starting to understand, is what you offer when you don't intend to stay long enough to share the weight. He didn't call before I came by. I still believed then that some doors didn't need permission. It was late afternoon. The light in the kitchen was thin, tired. He stood at the counter, mail spread out like evidence he hadn't asked to collect. I picked up an envelope without thinking, the way people do when they want to appear involved without committing to anything. "You know," I said, frowning at the return address, "if you'd told me earlier, things might have been different." He took the envelope from my hand, slowly. Not angry, just precise. He placed it back on the counter before he spoke. "I did tell you," he said. "For years. You just heard it as background noise." I laughed once, not because it was funny, because I didn't know how else to hold my ground. "Come on. You're acting like I did this to you." That's when he looked at me. Really looked. Not waiting. Not accommodating. "I'm done carrying this alone." The sentence landed clean. No explanation attached. No invitation to negotiate. Then he told me he was selling the house. Not as an idea. As a decision already made. He said it wasn't about starting fresh. It was about finishing something that had gone on too long. I reached for history. "That house is ours," I said. "It's everything." He shook his head. "It's responsibility. And it's been mine." I asked, without thinking, where that left me. He didn't hesitate. "Not here. Not like before." There it was, the door closing without sound, without drama. Just alignment. I stood there a moment longer, waiting for him to soften, to qualify, to make space. He didn't. The version of him that absorbed everything quietly wasn't available anymore. When I left, he didn't follow me to the door. I didn't look back. Outside, the air felt unchanged. That's what surprised me most. The world kept moving. I just wasn't standing in the same place anymore. After that, what settled in wasn't guilt. It was clarity. The house sold faster than I expected. He handled it quietly, efficiently, the way he handled everything once he stopped asking for permission. I wasn't part of the process. That absence felt intentional. Earned. When he moved, he didn't tell me the address right away. I didn't ask. We went months without speaking. Not out of anger, out of recalibration. The kind that happens when two people finally stop pretending they're standing on the same ground. When we did talk again, his voice was different. Lighter, but not in the way people mean when they say things have improved. It was lighter because it no longer carried me. He talked about practical things. A smaller place, fewer obligations. No history attached to the walls. I listened. I didn't offer advice. I'd learned, too late, what advice costs. My life kept moving. It always had, but movement felt different without the illusion that someone else was holding the line behind me. Success lost some of its shine once I understood what had financed it. Independence stopped feeling clean. People still say things like, "You did what you had to do," or "Not everyone is meant to stay." I don't argue. Explanations don't fix imbalance. They just decorate it. Sometimes I replay that moment in the kitchen. The envelope, the sentence, the way his voice didn't waver when he said he was done carrying it alone. I understand now that it wasn't rejection. It was redistribution. I did make it without him. That part is true. What took me years to admit is that without him didn't mean alone. It meant at his expense. And knowing that doesn't undo anything. It just makes the truth harder to misname.